September 7th, 1812. Across the rolling fields of Russia, two of the largest armies Europe had ever seen stood face to face. On one side was the legendary Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of Europe. On the other stood the Russian army led by Mikhail Kutuzov, a commander determined to stop Napoleon's invasion. What followed would become the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 soldiers would fall, and yet the battle would end with a mystery. Did Napoleon win, or did Russia? This is the story of the Battle of Borodino. The invasion of 1812. Napoleon's hubris. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte launched the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic campaign of his storied career. His objective was deceptively simple: to force Tsar Alexander I back into the continental system and permanently shatter Russian resistance to French hegemony in Europe. To achieve this, Napoleon assembled a juggernaut, the Grande Armée. This was a multinational force of over 600,000 soldiers, the largest military machine Western history had ever witnessed. As they crossed the Niemen River, the sheer scale of the invasion seemed to guarantee a swift and decisive victory. A war of shadows. However, the Russian High Command had no intention of engaging Napoleon in the kind of grand, set-piece battle he mastered. Instead, they utilized the sheer vastness of their territory as a weapon. As the French surged eastward, the Russians executed a relentless, scorched earth policy. Systematic destruction. They burned entire harvests and razed villages to the ground. Starvation tactics. By destroying infrastructure and food supplies, they left the French with nothing but ash and barren soil. The invisible toll. Without adequate supplies, the Grande Armée began to wither from disease, exhaustion, and desertion before even firing a major shot. The road to Borodino. By the time the French reached the outskirts of Moscow, the once mighty force had been hollowed out, its numbers shrinking dramatically under the strain of the endless march. It was only then that the Russian leadership decided to turn and face the Corsican ogre. They dug in near a small nondescript village roughly 70 miles west of Moscow. That village was Borodino, and it was destined to become the site of the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. The battlefield at Borodino was a tactical nightmare of rolling hills, dense forests, and winding stream beds. Recognizing the importance of the terrain, Russian engineers worked feverishly to transform the landscape into a fortress. They anchored their defense on three pivotal fortifications that would soon become the focal points of the carnage: the Bagration Flèches, the Raevski Redoubt, and the defensive lines along the Kolocha River. These positions formed a deadly defensive arc, designed to bleed the French army dry. The scale of the impending clash was staggering. The Russian Empire deployed approximately 120,000 soldiers supported by 640 cannons, while Napoleon's Grande Armée brought roughly 130,000 troops and 580 cannons to the field. Under the command of Mikhail Kutuzov for the Russians and Napoleon Bonaparte for the French, both sides understood that this would not be a battle of subtle maneuvers. It was to be a massive, head-on collision of raw power. Comparison of forces. The Russian Empire, 120,000 soldiers, 640 cannons, commanded by Mikhail Kutuzov. The French Empire, Grande Armée, 130,000 soldiers, 580 cannons commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon stood on a slight elevation, his telescope trained on the horizon as he meticulously studied the Russian positions. It was a daunting sight. The Russian center, anchored by the massive Raevski Redoubt, was a bristling wall of bayonets and cannons, almost impossible to take by direct assault. However, Napoleon's keen eye spotted what he believed to be a critical weakness: the Russian left flank. His strategic assessment led to a plan that was as simple as it was brutal. Rather than attempting a complex maneuver, he decided to launch a massive, concentrated hammer blow against the Russian left. His objective was clear: smash through the Bagratión Fleches, shatter the Russian flank, and then roll up the entire enemy army from the side, trapping them against the Kolocha River. To signal the start of this titanic struggle, Napoleon did what he did best. He unleashed the power of his beautiful daughters, his beloved artillery. At approximately 6 a.m., the order was given, and hundreds of French cannons opened fire simultaneously. The opening salvo. A wall of fire. Over 100 guns concentrated their fire on the Bagratión Fleches alone, creating a localized inferno of iron and dirt. The earth trembled. The sheer volume of the bombardment was so intense that soldiers reported the ground shaking miles away, a physical manifestation of the raw power being leveled at the Russian lines. The fog of war. Within minutes, the morning air was choked with thick, acrid black powder smoke, obscuring the sun and plunging the battlefield into a premature, artificial twilight. The silence of the Russian countryside was gone, replaced by the rhythmic thunder of the heavy guns. The Battle of Borodino had officially begun, not with a whimper, but with a roar that signaled the beginning of the end for thousands of men on both sides. The French infantry began their advance, disappearing into a literal wall of sulfurous smoke and whistling iron. This was no longer a tactical maneuver. It was a descent into an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. Wave after wave of blue-coated soldiers charged toward the Russian fortifications, their rhythmic drums struggling to be heard over the deafening roar of nearly 1,000 cannons. The Bagratión Fleches quickly transformed into a horrific killing ground. As the French closed the distance, Russian artillery, firing at point-blank range with canister shot, tore gaping holes in the advancing ranks, turning entire platoons into a memory in a single heartbeat. Yet the French kept coming, driven by a mixture of discipline, desperation, and the iron will of their emperor, the meat grinder of the flesh. The struggle for these earthworks was characterized by a savage back-and-forth rhythm. The fortifications changed hands multiple times, with each successful surge met by an equally ferocious counter-surge. Brutal close combat. When the ammunition ran low, the fighting devolved into a primal struggle. Men fought with fixed bayonets, the butts of their muskets, and their bare hands. The disappearing regiments. The intensity was so concentrated that entire veteran regiments, units that had survived years of campaigning across Europe, simply ceased to exist within minutes of entering the fray. A heavy toll. By mid-morning, the soil around the Fleches was no longer visible, covered entirely by the blue and green uniforms of the fallen. The fall of a legend. At the heart of the resistance was the fiery Russian general, Pyotr Bagration. A man of immense charisma, he refused to lead from the rear. He personally rallied his thinning lines, leading desperate counterattacks to reclaim the lost V-shaped works. However, during one of these frantic surges, a shard of French shell fire struck him, inflicting a mortal wound. The sight of their commander falling from his horse sent a shock wave through the ranks. Bagration's fall shattered the morale of the Russian left flank. Without his guiding presence, the cohesion of the defense began to fray. Eventually, after hours of relentless, soul-crushing assault, the French finally managed to secure the flèches. They stood atop the blood-soaked ramparts, but it was a hollow triumph. The victory had come at a catastrophic cost in lives, and the Russian line, though battered and grieving, had not yet broken. While the left flank was consumed by fire and blood, an equally apocalyptic struggle erupted in the center of the Russian line. The objective was the Raevsky Redoubt, a massive, earth-shaken fortification bristling with heavy cannons that dominated the entire battlefield. To the French, it became known as the Great Redoubt, and to those who fought there, it was simply the volcano. Napoleon's forces launched repeated, grueling assaults against the hill, but each wave was met by a literal wall of iron. The Russian gunners, refusing to retreat, waited until the French were nearly upon them before unleashing devastating canister shot. Thousands of metal balls that turned the advancing columns into a harrowing scene of carnage. The cavalry charge into the inferno. In one of the most legendary and desperate moments of the Napoleonic Wars, French heavy cavalry, the ironclad cuirassiers, were ordered to do the impossible, charge directly into the mouth of the redoubt. Into the smoke, horses and riders thundered up the slope, crashing through a landscape of choking black powder smoke and whistling shells. The melee. The fighting within the redoubt became a chaotic, primal nightmare. There was no room for maneuver. Point-blank carnage. Cannons were fired at such close range that the blast alone could kill. Soldiers who lost their weapons fought with heavy sabers, fixed bayonets, and even bare hands in a desperate struggle for every inch of the blood-soaked earth. A Pyrrhic victory. After hours of this savage, unrelenting combat, the French troops finally swarmed over the ramparts. The Russian defenders fought to the last man, but eventually, the tricolor flag was raised over the smoking ruins of the redoubt. The center had fallen. However, as the smoke began to clear, the true horror of the day was revealed. The battlefield had been transformed into a literal sea of death. The Great Redoubt was no longer a fortification. It was a mass grave. Tens of thousands of soldiers, the elite of both empires, lay dead or mangled across the hills of Borodino. The French had captured the ground, but they had decimated their own army to do it. Metric comparison of the center's toll. French casualties. Thousands of elite cavalry and infantry lost in the final surge. Russian casualties. Entire divisions wiped out while defending the heights. Atmosphere. A landscape defined by the shriek of shells and the groans of the dying. By the late afternoon, the battlefield had become a landscape of unparalleled devastation. The Russian army was battered, bleeding, and exhausted. Its lines pushed back, but remarkably still holding. To many of Napoleon's top marshals, the moment for the decisive blow had finally arrived. They looked toward the horizon, where the most feared unit in Europe stood idle, the Imperial Guard. These were Napoleon's elite, the Old Guard, veteran warriors who had never been defeated and whose very presence on the field often caused enemy lines to crumble in terror. His commanders, including the fiery Marshal Ney, urged him to unleash this final reserve. If the Guard attacked now, they argued, they would shatter the remaining Russian resistance and completely annihilate the Tsar's army, ending the war in a single afternoon. the emperor's hesitation. But for the first time in his career, the great captain hesitated. Napoleon surveyed the carnage and looked at his maps. He was nearly 1,800 miles from Paris, deep within the heart of a hostile and unforgiving Russia. The risk of total collapse. Napoleon knew that the Imperial Guard was the ultimate insurance policy for his empire. If he sent them in, and they were decimated by Russian artillery, he would have no elite force left to protect his retreat or secure his throne. A gamble. Too far. Despite the pleas of his generals, he muttered his famous refusal. "I will not have my guard destroyed." At 800 leagues from Paris, one doesn't risk his last reserve. A turning point in history. Napoleon's decision to hold the guard back is a moment that historians still debate with fierce intensity today. By refusing to commit his elite troops, he allowed the Russian army to survive. The Russian withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the Russian forces, though crippled, were able to retreat in good order, slipping away to fight another day. The missing victory. The final crushing blow never came. Napoleon had won the field, but he'd failed to destroy the enemy's will or their ability to wage war. The sun set over Borodino on a scene of absolute horror. Napoleon had technically cleared the path to Moscow, but by sparing his guard, he had unwittingly ensured the eventual destruction of the rest of his Grande Armée. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills of Borodino, a haunting, unnatural silence settled over the landscape, interrupted only by the distant groans of the dying. Both the French and Russian armies were utterly spent, their physical and moral strength ground down to nothing by a day of unrelenting slaughter. Neither side possessed the energy or the reserves to strike a final, decisive blow. In the dead of night, under the cover of a thick, sulphurous mist, Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov made a cold, strategic calculation. He knew his army could not survive another day of such attrition. To save the Russian Empire, he had to save its soldiers. He issued the order for the Russian army to withdraw toward Moscow, leaving the blood-soaked earth to the French. A hollow triumph. Technically, Napoleon was the victor. He remained in possession of the battlefield, and the road to the ancient capital of Moscow now lay open. But it was a hollow victory, a win that felt more like a slow-motion catastrophe. The statistics of the day remained some of the most staggering in military history. The French toll. Approximately 35,000 men were lost, including an irreplaceable number of veteran officers and elite cavalry. The Russian toll. Over 40,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, nearly a third of their entire force. The grim record, with over 75,000 total casualties in a single day, roughly one man every couple of seconds. Borodino earned its reputation as the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. The Pyrrhic reality: Napoleon had won the ground, but he had failed to win the war. He had sought a cannée, a total destruction of the enemy, but instead, he had merely pushed them back. The Russian army was bruised and battered, but it was still intact, retreating into the vast, freezing interior of their homeland. Napoleon would soon march into Moscow, expecting a surrender that would never come. Instead, he would find a city of ghosts and flames, marking the beginning of the most disastrous retreat in the history of warfare. Exactly 1 week after the carnage at Borodino, Napoleon Bonaparte rode through the gates of Moscow, expecting a formal surrender. Instead, he found an eerie, silent ghost town. The Tsar had fled, taking the city's fire brigades and the majority of its population with him. The victory was a mirage. Within hours of the French occupation, strategically placed fires, ignited by Russian saboteurs, erupted across the city. Built largely of wood, Moscow quickly transformed into a roaring inferno. For 4 days, Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his prize turned to ash. The dying embers of an empire Napoleon waited for 5 weeks in the ruins, hoping for a peace treaty that never arrived. Meanwhile, the shadow of the Russian winter began to stretch across the plains. The Battle of Borodino had not achieved the decisive destruction of the Russian army. Instead, it had bled the Grande Armée of its strength and its momentum. The consequences of that bloody day in September soon became clear. A hollow conquest. Napoleon held the capital, but he possessed no supplies, no shelter, and no defeated enemy. The Great Retreat. In October, the French began a desperate march back toward Europe. Harassed by Cossacks and decimated by the general winter, temperatures that plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, the retreat became a trail of frozen corpses. The collapse of a legend. Of the 600,000 men who had marched east, fewer than 100,000 would crawl back across the border. The invasion of 1812 didn't just fail, it shattered the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. From that point forward, the coalition against him grew bolder, eventually leading to his exile. Today, the fields of Borodino remain hallowed ground, a quiet expanse of monuments and rolling hills that serves as a permanent reminder of the day when 2 of history's greatest empires bled themselves dry. Summary of the campaign's end event outcome. Capture of Moscow. Napoleon occupies a burning, empty city. No surrender is offered. The retreat. A catastrophic 500-mile march through snow and enemy ambushes. Legacy of Borodino. Recognized as the turning point that drained the French Empire of its finest veterans.